Claire Anderson stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, with one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly and the other clutching a brown paper package tied with simple twine, and her heart pounded against her ribs like a desperate bird seeking freedom from a cage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble columns of the district courthouse, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, as lawyers and plaintiffs and curious onlookers passed by, whispering and wondering why a heavily pregnant woman would be standing alone at such a place. 6 months had passed since Matthew had walked out of their home with nothing but a suitcase and a cold declaration that he needed space and freedom. And now here she was, preparing to face him in a battle she never imagined she would have to fight. The courtroom doors loomed before her like the gates of some ancient fortress, and she took a deep breath, feeling her baby kick as if offering encouragement and strength for what lay ahead. Inside the building, the air was thick with tension and the smell of old wood and legal documents, and she made her way down the corridor past offices filled with stern-faced attorneys and tearful clients whose lives hung in the balance of judicial decisions. Matthew was already seated when she entered the courtroom, flanked by his lawyer, Richard Pemberton, who wore an expensive suit and an expression of smug confidence that made Claire's stomach turn. Her estranged husband looked different now, with his hair styled perfectly and wearing a watch she had never seen before, and when their eyes met across the room, his face remained cold and impassive, as if she were a stranger rather than the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams for 5 years. Judge Maria Hartwell entered with commanding presence, and everyone rose in respect, and Claire noticed how the judge's sharp eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room, including her obvious pregnancy and the mysterious package she held. The proceedings began with Matthew's lawyer speaking in smooth, calculated tones about assets and property division and custody arrangements, and with each word, Claire felt her resolve harden like steel forged in fire. She had made her decision weeks ago when she realized that words alone would never penetrate the wall of lies and manipulation that Matthew had constructed, and so she had chosen a different path, one that required patience and courage and absolute faith in the truth. When Judge Hartwell asked if she had legal representation, she simply shook her head and placed the package on the table before her, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Matthew leaned forward, whispering urgently to his lawyer, and she could see confusion and perhaps a flicker of fear crossing his face. And in that moment, she knew that her silence was more powerful than any argument she could have made. The judge frowned and asked again if she intended to defend herself, and Claire met her gaze steadily and gestured to the package and then to the judge, making clear without words that everything the court needed to know was contained within that simple brown wrapping. The courtroom buzzed with confusion as Judge Hartwell examined the package sitting innocuously on the table, and Matthew's lawyer rose to object, claiming that unverified evidence presented without proper legal procedure was inadmissible and inappropriate. Claire remained silent, watching as the judge considered the objection, and she could feel her baby moving restlessly inside her, as if sensing the tension that filled every corner of the room. Behind her in the gallery, she knew David Brennan was sitting in the 3rd row, and his presence alone gave her strength, even though she had not turned to look at him since entering the courtroom. David had been her friend since college, when they had met in a literature class and bonded over their shared love of classic novels and late-night conversations about dreams and life and everything in between. He had been there when she met Matthew at a charity gala and had stood beside her at her wedding, even though she sometimes caught a look in his eyes that suggested he harbored feelings he would never speak aloud. When Matthew left, she had called David in tears, and he had driven through the night to be with her, holding her as she sobbed and promising that whatever happened, he would stand by her side. It was David who had helped her gather the evidence, now contained in that package.
spending countless hours tracking down witnesses and documents and proof of the double life Matthew had been living. Judge Hartwell finally spoke, saying that while the presentation was highly irregular, she would examine the contents in chambers before making a determination. And Matthew's face went pale as realization dawned that his carefully constructed facade might be about to crumble. The judge called for a recess, and bailiffs escorted everyone out of the courtroom, while she retreated to examine the mysterious package, and Claire walked slowly into the hallway, feeling exhausted and hopeful and terrified all at once. David was there immediately, offering his arm for support and guiding her to a bench near the windows, where sunlight streamed through and created patterns on the tile floor. He did not ask questions or offer reassurances, but simply sat beside her with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. And in that quiet moment, she felt more loved and protected than she had in all the years of her marriage. Across the hall, Matthew paced like a caged animal while his lawyer made frantic phone calls, and Claire could see the cracks forming in his composure as minutes stretched into an hour. Other people in the courthouse watched with growing curiosity as word spread about the pregnant woman who refused to speak and the mysterious package that might change everything. Finally, a bailiff emerged and announced that Judge Hartwell was ready to reconvene, and everyone filed back into the courtroom with an electric sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The judge sat behind her bench with the opened package before her, and Claire noticed that her expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something that looked almost like anger mixed with sympathy. Matthew gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white, and his lawyer looked distinctly uncomfortable, as if he suddenly realized his client had not been entirely truthful about the circumstances of the separation. Judge Hartwell cleared her throat and began to speak, describing the contents of the package in careful detail. And with each revelation, the courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs.
Inside the package, Judge Hartwell explained, were bank statements showing that Matthew had been systematically transferring money from their joint accounts into a secret account under his name alone, beginning nearly a year before he announced his intention to leave. There were also photographs documenting Matthew with another woman named Jessica Winters at restaurants and hotels and vacation destinations spanning back 18 months, and the timeline made clear that his affair had begun long before Claire became pregnant. Text messages, printed and organized chronologically, revealed conversations between Matthew and Jessica discussing their plans for a future together and their hope that Claire would simply accept a divorce settlement without fighting for what was rightfully hers. Most damning of all were emails between Matthew and a private investigator he had hired to find anything he could use against Claire in court. And the investigator's reports concluded repeatedly that she was faithful and honest and devoted entirely to their marriage and coming child. Judge Hartwell's voice grew harder as she described documents showing that Matthew had forged Claire's signature on loan applications and had taken out substantial debt in both their names to finance his secret life with Jessica. There were also medical records that Claire had obtained through her own doctor, showing that Matthew had scheduled a vasectomy consultation 2 years earlier and then canceled it only after Claire expressed her deep desire to start a family. The judge held up a letter written in Matthew's own hand to Jessica, promising that once he secured the house and the business assets from the divorce, he would be free to marry her, and they could start fresh without the burden of a child he never really wanted. Matthew's lawyer stood, attempting to object, but his protest died in his throat as the judge continued reading from depositions given by Matthew's colleagues and friends who confirmed that he had openly complained about feeling trapped by the pregnancy. Claire watched as her husband's face transformed from shock to rage to something resembling panic, and she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep sadness that their love had been built on such unstable ground. David leaned forward in his seat behind her, and she could feel his supportive presence like a warm blanket on a cold night. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond this courtroom battle. Judge Hartwell then revealed the final item from the package, which was a handwritten letter from Claire herself, explaining why she had chosen silence over speech and truth over testimony. In the letter, Claire wrote that she had loved Matthew with her whole heart and had believed in their marriage even when signs suggested she should have been more cautious. She explained that when she discovered his betrayal and his plans to manipulate the legal system to leave her with nothing, she had been devastated. But then she had remembered who she truly was beneath the pain. Claire wrote that she was a woman who valued truth and justice and the well-being of her unborn child above all else, and she would not participate in a circus of accusations and counter-accusations when the evidence could speak for itself. She asked the judge to consider not just the financial crimes Matthew had committed, but the emotional cruelty of a man who would bring a child into the world while secretly wishing it had never been conceived. The letter concluded with Claire's simple request that she be granted full custody and a fair division of assets so that she could build a safe and loving home for her baby, and that Matthew be held accountable for his deceptions. Judge Hartwell set the letter down and looked directly at Matthew with an expression of barely contained disgust and asked if he had anything to say in his defense. Matthew opened his mouth, but no words came out, and his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly advising him that anything he said now would only make matters worse. The judge then turned to Claire, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she smiled slightly and nodded, as if acknowledging the courage and intelligence it had taken to present truth in such an unconventional way.
Judge Hartwell removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose before speaking, and the entire courtroom seemed frozen in time, waiting for her words to reshape the lives of everyone present. She began by stating that in her 20 years on the bench, she had rarely encountered such a clear case of deliberate deception and financial manipulation, and she commended Claire for her restraint and dignity in presenting the facts without theatrical emotion. The judge ruled that all jointly held assets would be divided, with Claire receiving 70% given Matthew's fraudulent transfers and his attempts to hide marital property from the court. Furthermore, custody of the unborn child would be granted primarily to Claire, with Matthew receiving only supervised visitation rights, pending a psychological evaluation and mandatory parenting classes. Judge Hartwell also ordered Matthew to pay all outstanding debts he had incurred in both their names and to reimburse Claire for legal costs and emotional damages in an amount that made his lawyer visibly wince. Matthew slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse around him, and Jessica, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, slipped out quietly, as if suddenly realizing she had attached herself to a sinking ship. The judge continued, explaining that she was also referring the case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges related to forgery and fraud, and Matthew's face went from pale to ashen gray. Claire felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of vindication or triumph, but rather tears of release and relief that the nightmare was finally ending. Judge Hartwell addressed Claire directly, thanking her for her faith in the judicial system and wishing her well in her journey into motherhood, and then she brought down her gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent room. As people began to file out of the courtroom, several strangers approached Claire to offer congratulations and support, and she was overwhelmed by the kindness of people she had never met. David was at her side immediately, guiding her through the crowd and protecting her from the questions reporters were already beginning to shout from the courthouse steps. They made their way to his car, parked in the lot behind a building. And as soon as they were inside, Claire finally allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing with a mixture of exhaustion and liberation. David held her hand and waited patiently for the storm to pass, and when she finally looked up at him through tear-streaked eyes, she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. He told her quietly that he had watched her go through hell over the past months, and that her strength and grace had only deepened the feelings he had carried for her since the day they met. Claire started to protest, saying she was pregnant and broken and not ready for anything beyond survival. But David stopped her gently, saying he was not asking for anything except the chance to be as her friend and support system. He promised that when she was ready, if she was ever ready, he would be waiting. because some people were worth waiting for, and she was one of them. They drove to Claire's apartment in comfortable silence, and David helped her inside, making sure she had everything she needed before preparing to leave. Claire watched him gather his jacket and keys, and suddenly she could not bear the thought of being alone, and she asked him to stay, just for a little while longer. David smiled and settled onto the couch, and she curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder and feeling safe for the first time in what seemed like forever.
3 months passed in a blur of doctor appointments and nursery preparations, and slowly learning to trust in the possibility of happiness again, and David was there through it all, never pushing, never demanding, but always present. Claire gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Emma Rose on a crisp October morning, and when David arrived at the hospital with flowers and a teddy bear, his eyes filled with tears as he looked at the tiny bundle in her arms. He held Emma with the gentleness of someone who understood how precious and fragile new life could be, and Claire watched him coo and whisper promises to protect this little girl always, and she felt something shift deep inside her heart. The following weeks were exhausting as Claire adjusted to the demands of new motherhood, but David appeared every evening to help with dishes and laundry and to simply hold Emma so Claire could shower or sleep. Matthew had visited once under court supervision, and it seemed uncomfortable and disconnected from his daughter, as if she were a stranger's child. And after that first visit, he had made excuses to postpone future meetings. Claire felt sad for Emma that her father could not find it in himself to love her, but she also felt grateful that her daughter would be surrounded by people who truly cared, rather than those who saw her as an obligation. On a cold December evening, David arrived with takeout food and found Claire sitting in the rocking chair with Emma asleep in her arms and tears running silently down her face. He immediately knelt beside the chair, asking what was wrong, and Claire explained that she was not sad, but overwhelmed by how much her life had changed and how different her family looked from what she had imagined. David wiped her tears and told her that families came in all shapes and sizes, and that what mattered was love and commitment, and the choice to show up every single day. Claire looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since this whole ordeal began, and she saw a man who had proven his devotion through actions rather than words, and who had loved her even when she could not love herself. She reached out and touched his face gently, asking if his earlier offer still stood, and if he was still willing to wait for someone as complicated and damaged as she felt. David laughed softly and said she was not damaged, but transformed, and that he had never stopped waiting and would continue waiting as long as it took. Claire leaned forward and kissed him tenderly and carefully so as not to wake Emma, and in that simple gesture, she felt the beginning of something real and lasting, being built on a foundation of friendship and trust. They decided to take things slowly, letting their relationship develop naturally without pressure or expectations. And David continued to live in his own apartment while spending increasing amounts of time at Claire's home. Emma grew and thrived, surrounded by love, and as months turned into a year, Claire found herself laughing more easily and dreaming more boldly about the future. David proposed on Emma's first birthday in the same park where they had studied together in college, and Claire said yes, without hesitation, knowing that this time she was choosing a partner who had already proven his worth. They married in a small ceremony with only close friends and family present, and Emma toddled down the aisle in a white dress, scattering flower petals and bringing tears to everyone's eyes. Matthew signed away his parental rights shortly after the wedding, citing his inability to bond with Emma and his desire to move forward with his life. And while Claire felt a pang of sorrow for what might have been, she also felt relief. David legally adopted Emma and became the father she deserved.
And as Claire watched him read bedtime stories and teach her daughter to ride a bicycle, she knew that sometimes the greatest love stories were the ones that grew slowly from friendship into something unbreakable. Years later, when Emma asked about her biological father, Claire told her the truth in age-appropriate terms and explained that families were defined not by biology, but by love and choice and commitment. Emma hugged David fiercely and declared that he was her real daddy in every way that mattered. And Claire caught David's eye across the room and saw the same love and gratitude reflected there that she felt in her own heart. The mysterious package that had changed everything sat in a box in the attic now. And occasionally, Claire would take it out and remember the woman she had been in that courtroom, silent but strong, and she would feel proud of how far she had come. Life was not perfect, and there were still challenges and difficult days, but Claire had learned that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it with courage and surrounding yourself with people who would stand beside you through the storms. And as she watched David and Emma building a blanket fort in the living room, laughing and creating memories that would last a lifetime, she knew that her bold move in that courtroom had been the first step toward building the life and family she had always deserved.